Another vehicle graveyard has formed on the northern flank of Pokrovsk as the fighting continues over the intersection that leads into the city. The Russians, since the initial push and breakthrough through the defensive line along the river line here to the northeast of Pokrovsk, managed to reach the outskirts of Rodynske. However, they never managed to physically cut off the road, but they were still within close proximity to it, and FPV drones were constantly able to strike it. This forced the Ukrainians to launch numerous counterattacks in an attempt to regain control over the areas, to yet again secure the supply lines into the city, because failing to do so would result in the following video. What we're seeing is that the Russians struck Ukrainian supplies and counterattack vehicles that were driving down from the highway itself and from Rodynske in the western direction. Whether they went down south towards Pokrovsk itself or in the eastern direction for a counterattack towards the Russian positions, what we see here is a graveyard of these vehicles. The first one is a gathering of about 8 vehicles. It is located right about the eastern flank, going in the eastern direction towards the southern flank of Rodynske. Then there are numerous vehicles on the road itself continuously from the top and down to the bottom of the screen. So what we're seeing is that the Ukrainians had continuously been resupplying, but they were constantly under fire whenever they tried to push through. There are graveyard vehicles from the intersection from the western direction through Rodynske, along the highway itself, and to the east in the southern flank of Rodynske. All of them number above 20 vehicles, from infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers to regular pickup trucks. This is both supplies and troop transportations, but there are no tanks. These are the consequences on one of the highways leading into the city following the Russian incursion on the northern flank of Pokrovsk and operational encirclement of it. The Russian objective is to continue this operational encirclement to limit the areas where Ukrainian vehicles can pass through. The fewer roads, the more concentrated fire the Russians are capable of, and the fewer vehicles are able to pass through and avoid the drone fire, artillery fire, and what else fire the Russians are using to disable these vehicles along the intersection. The Russians also continued offensive operations on the northern flank, where they managed to recapture Rodynske for the second time in just a week, where the Ukrainians yet again are launching counterattacks to regain control of it. The Ukrainians have been counterattacking with infantry fighting vehicles, mainly the Bradley variant, where they are dropping off infantry in the forest patch area here west of Nikhonorivka. The Russians are operating from Nikhonorivka itself towards Rodynske. Their positions within Rodynske are not very defensible. It's a very small town, and the positions can be cleared quickly. It is an outpost at best. The objective of the Russians is not to gain control over Rodynske itself, but to cut off the supplies that lead to the Ukrainian positions south of Nikhonorivka, where they cannot pass through except for across the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth Alliance, if the Russians have control over Rodynske. This is why heavy fighting continues over the area. It is for the supplies and not for the town itself. To the northeast, following the capture of Volodymyrivka, the Russians have expanded offensive operations on the northern bank of the river line. This led to the encirclement of what remained of Ukrainian forces and capture of the road leading up to Shekhovo from the eastern direction. With this, the Russians have secured the southern flank outside of the town for future offensive operations towards the town itself. The full capture of Volodymyrivka happened according to Deep State Map, not just with the 6 vehicles that were initially reported, but with 2 additional waves of armored pushes, which led to about a company-sized unit operating within Volodymyrivka, which allowed them to quickly clear it. This also shows the limited Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the area following the weeks of fighting that also led to the supplies being destroyed as they rolled in. This happened from the very first day, where the Russians had set up ambushes against the Azov forces which arrived, and as we saw, there never came out any videos of Azov's success, despite them liking to brag about it, which shows the effectiveness of the strategy that the Russians have been using here on the northern flank of Pokrovsk. Moving on to the southern direction, the Russians have made numerous advances along the first and second lines of defense. Along the first line of defense, the Russians gained control over the eastern farm area just outside Poltavka and the northern parts, leaving just a small residential area remaining under Ukrainian control east of the Yanchur River, here close to the first line of defense here in the Zaporizhia region. To the north of this, there are still the fortified positions. Until that point, the Russians controlled the eastern parts near Novoselivske down to Melenivka. In the northern direction, the Russians expanded zone of control within Oleksivka and the surrounding forest lines leading up to Oleksivka, where they have control over approximately half of the town now. Gaining full control of it will again lead to the Russians having control over the road that leads up to the Vovcha River line, which can cut off the southern supplies going through towards Orestopil and the Ukrainian forces counterattacking in the vicinity of the Vovcha River line. This will allow them to concentrate their forces in the direction of Sosnivka, Khoroshe, and Novoselivka to regain control over the areas recently lost due to the Ukrainian counterattack and everything south of the Vovcha River line, all the way up to Tuche and in the western direction along the second line of defense. In the northern section of the front line, the Russians continue their offensive operations within Yempil, where they've managed to gain control over additional streets within the settlement, gain full control over the northern parts of it, and pushing the Ukrainians out into the first patch areas. The Russians will likely look to combine their forces in the southern bank of Zarishne, where they'll look to push in the direction of the northern flank of Yempil to gain control over the fortifications by a combined push from the eastern, southern, and northern directions, to gain full control over the first patch areas here along the Sherebets river line, and to gain control over the northern flank of Yempil, limiting the Ukrainian resupply capabilities to the southern flank through the highway from Liman and up towards Yempil, where the Russians can focus their forces in the southern direction to gain control over the entirety of the town, and then down towards the highway. The positional fighting taking place here to the east of Liman is an attempt by the Russian forces to limit the supplies going into Liman to a single road, and that is the Slovyansk-Liman highway. This is to repeat the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. And what we are seeing in the Pokrovsk direction is not the first of the kind. Although the casualty numbers is in the numbers of the Ukrainian summer offensive in 2023, it is a similar case to what we saw in Bakhmut during the spring of 2023, where the Russians have managed to gain control over all roads leading into Bakhmut, except for the Ivanivsky highway leading into Bakhmut from the south, while the Ukrainians centered their counterattacks in the direction of the Khomova road. So we see that the Russians had limited the supplies going into Bakhmut and what remained under Ukrainian control within the city during the final months of the battle. And this led to a similar case where the Russians would strike all of the vehicles the Ukrainians were using on the western flank of Bakhmut, and this was drying the Ukrainian supplies during the battle of attrition that took place. The Russian tactics are all centered around the fact that the Ukrainians refuse to give up any sort of territory, no matter how long it takes. This allows them to create these semi-encirclements where they leave a road open, not to force the Ukrainians to withdraw, but to force the Ukrainians to resupply those forces under constant fire. And this leads to numerous casualties for the Ukrainians, both in terms of vehicles and manpower, as they are lost before they even arrive at any position to entrench themselves and defend the city. Instead, they are lost on the road. On the eastern bank of the Usk river line, the Russians continue offensive operations along the river line itself, where they've managed to gain control over the majority of Zahrizove. What we see is that there is this located footage which confirms a Russian push through it. Zahrizove has been in the gray zone for a very long time, as neither the Russians nor Ukrainians were able to gain full control of it. Now what we're seeing is that the Russians made a large push on the eastern flank of the fortifications over the past half a year or so, following the capture of Selmaivka, which led them to push towards these fortifications and spread out the Ukrainian forces from being concentrated in the Zarizove direction and up towards Losove, Zelenihai, Boryska, and Rivka. This allowed the Russians to consolidate their positions within Zahrizove, especially through the first patch area, and gain control over the northern parts and central parts of the town, leaving the Ukrainians in the southern parts of it. The Russian objective here is to gain control over the fortifications along Novoplatonivka. If they're able to clear the positions north of the fortifications, then they can concentrate their efforts on the fortifications themselves. Therefore, the Russian objective right now is to push through the fortifications on the eastern flank, which includes the northern fortifications near Losova, as well as the western parts of Losova. On the northern flank, this will clear out the fortifications and the eastern flank of these settlements along the Uskar River line and allow the Russians to push through towards the defensive line, from which they can push from the eastern direction. They will also have the ability to supply the forces from the north once they capture one fortified position after the other. Gaining control over this northern defensive line significantly strengthens their positions along the Uskar River line and increases their ability to gain a bridgehead in the vicinity of Senkova, as they can do so without direct fire on the flanks from Ukrainian forces. Finally, in the north, in the Sumy region, the Russians have managed to regain control for the southern bank of the river line here in the northeastern flank of Kindrativka. This takes place following numerous days and weeks of Ukrainian counterattacks in the vicinity of Oleksivka. The Ukrainians have been attempting for months, really, to regain control over Oleksivka, Vereshchina, and Novomykolaiivka. They have been failing so far, recapturing Vereshchina a couple of times, but every time they are either kicked out or the Russians recapture the settlement, and then they try again. This was to cut off the supply routes leading into Oleksivka. The Russians, what they are doing is that they're concentrating much of their manpower on the flanks, not really the positions themselves. This allows typically the Ukrainians to regain control over these positions, but then the flanks come in to counterattack, and this leads to a Russian recapture of those positions. The objective of this is that the Ukrainians would be losing manpower and forces going into the settlement while they are on the move, and once they are inside, FAB bombs drop on them. This allows the Russians to attack the weakened Ukrainian forces and regain control of it. This then forces Ukraine to repeat the same movement where they counterattack again, and while they are moving towards the town, they are struck while moving, and then once they enter, yet again FAB bombs. So that is the repeated tactic that the Russians have been using all across the front line, leaving weak defenses in the settlements themselves. Once the Ukrainians are entrenched, FAB bombs rain down on them on predetermined destinations, and this leads to the Russians recapturing the settlements quickly, as we're seeing along the Vovcha River line in the southern section of the front line, where the Ukrainians launched a counterattack across the river line to re-enter Sechneve, Novoselivka, Sosnivka, and so on. These positions were all weakened, where the main forces of the Russians were on the flanks, continuing offensive operations or defending other areas. Then, as soon as Ukrainian counterattacks happened, they're constantly striking those forces, quickly managing to kick them out of Sechneve and the northern flank of Novoselivka, while at Sosnivka they had stronger defenses. This also made the Ukrainians more focused on simply holding what they had and focusing on other areas. So we're seeing heavy fighting continuing along this section of the front line, but with a similar tactic where they're looking to make use of their firepower advantage to deal with the Ukrainian forces, limiting their own casualties while increasing the Ukrainians. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.